The biggest project of my career was stolen in less than 30 seconds. 3 years of research, hundreds of failed experiments, and thousands of quiet hours in a laboratory disappeared the moment the CEO's daughter walked into the room. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if this story truly speaks to you, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always enjoy connecting with listeners from all around the world. All right, now I'll continue. 15 investors were sitting across the table that morning. Some represented venture funds worth billions. Others had flown across the country to decide whether our company, Helixera Therapeutics, would receive funding for what could become a $2.4 billion commercialization deal. I was supposed to lead the presentation. Instead, I became the person quietly standing beside it. Just as I began explaining the stabilization phase of the platform I had spent 3 years developing, the door opened. Vanessa Callaway, the daughter of Helixera's CEO, walked straight to the front of the room. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look at me. She simply reached across the table, took the presentation remote from my hand, and turned off my slides. "We don't need your ideas anymore," she said calmly. Then she started presenting my research as if it were her own. For a moment, the room went silent. I waited for her father, Elliot Callaway, to say something. He didn't. He leaned back in his chair and smiled like everything had been planned. The investors followed his lead. Some nodded. One of them even started clapping. That was the moment I realized something important. They thought the presentation was the technology. They had no idea how wrong they were. My name is Lillian Moore. Until 48 hours after that meeting, I was the lead research scientist at Helixera Therapeutics, and the billion-dollar deal those investors came to approve. It collapsed before the week ended. Not because I sabotaged anything, but because the only person who knew how the platform actually worked was the one they had just dismissed in front of 15 investors. The next part of this story blends real emotions with a few fictional elements, shaped with the help of AI to make the message clearer and the experience more vivid. If the story resonates with you, I truly appreciate you being here, and if it doesn't, that's perfectly okay too. I simply wish you a calm evening and a peaceful night ahead. From the outside, nothing about that meeting looked unusual. To the investors sitting around the table, it probably felt like a normal corporate moment. A young executive stepping in with a stronger vision. A CEO allowing his daughter to take control of a promising project. Confidence sells well in boardrooms, and Vanessa Callaway delivered it perfectly. She spoke smoothly, moving through the slides with the calm certainty of someone who believed the technology already belonged to her. Molecular diagrams appeared on the screen. Reaction curves followed. Market projections filled the final slides. Everything looked convincing. Across the table, several investors nodded while taking notes. One of them leaned forward and asked a question about the stabilization phase. Vanessa answered without hesitation. Listening to her, you might have believed she understood the platform completely, but that was the strange part, because what she was presenting wasn't actually the technology. It was only the surface of it. The real breakthrough, the step that made the entire system work, was something that never appeared on those slides. Not in the diagrams, not in the data charts, not even in the official reports stored inside the company database. That part existed only in the quiet hours of the laboratory. 3 years of failed reaction cycles, 3 years of adjusting catalyst timing by seconds, 3 years of watching fragile compounds collapse before finally discovering the exact moment where the chemistry stabilized instead of degrading. Science rarely looks dramatic when you're living inside it. Most of the time, it looks like empty coffee cups, fluorescent lights, and equipment humming in a room long after everyone else has gone home. When people hear the word breakthrough, they imagine a dramatic moment, a brilliant flash of inspiration, a sudden discovery that changes everything overnight. Real science almost never works that way. Most of the time, it looks like 3 years of quiet persistence. 3 years of failed experiments, 3 years of reaction chambers flashing red warnings at 2 in the morning, 3 years of sitting alone in a laboratory while the rest of the building goes dark. That was what the stabilization platform really looked like. When Helixera Therapeutics hired me, the problem sounded deceptively simple. Many pharmaceutical compounds are extremely fragile. The moment they enter the bloodstream, they begin to break down. By the time the drug reaches the tissue, it's meant to treat tumors, damaged organs, specific cellular receptors. Much of it has already degraded. That's why so many treatments cause severe side effects. The medication spreads everywhere instead of staying where it's needed. My research focused on solving that problem. I developed a stabilization platform designed to keep those compounds chemically stable long enough to reach their intended targets before activating. If it worked reliably, it could transform how targeted therapies were delivered. For Helixera's investors, it represented something even more valuable: a massive new market. That stabilization platform was the entire reason 15 investors had gathered in that boardroom. It was the foundation of the deal they believed they were about to approve. But 8 months before that meeting, something changed inside the company. That was when Vanessa Calloway joined Helixera. Her official title was Director of Strategic Innovation. Unofficially, everyone understood the real reason she was there. She was being prepared for something bigger. Unlike most of the scientists in our research division, Vanessa had no background in molecular biology or pharmaceutical chemistry, but she quickly became very interested in my work. At first, it seemed harmless. She started asking detailed questions about the stabilization phase, about catalyst timing, reaction curves, equilibrium thresholds. Back then, I assumed she was trying to understand the research. Now I understand something very different. She wasn't trying to understand the science. She was trying to learn how to take it. As the investor meeting approached, Vanessa's interest in my research intensified. At first, it looked completely reasonable. Executives often wanted to understand the commercial potential of new technologies before major funding meetings. Usually, their questions were broad timelines, regulatory pathways, market projections. Vanessa's questions were different. She asked about the science, not casually, not vaguely, very precisely. How do you determine the stabilization window? She asked one afternoon while standing beside my workstation. What controls the reaction equilibrium during catalyst exposure? How do you know when the compound becomes chemically stable at the time? I assumed she was trying to learn. That assumption now feels embarrassingly naive. A few days later, she returned with another request. Could I review the documentation, she asked? The full platform report. That seemed harmless enough. The document was already stored in the company's internal research database, so I granted her access. A week later, she came back again. Would it be possible to see the raw experiment logs, she asked. That question made me pause. Official reports are polished and simplified. They present results clearly for executives and investors. Laboratory logs are different. They contain the messy reality of science. Failed trials, reaction notes scribbled at 3 a.m, small experimental adjustments that only make sense months later. But Vanessa smiled politely and explained she wanted to better understand the platform before the investor presentation. So I gave her access. Then she asked one more question. Would it be all right if I looked through your lab notebooks too? This time, I hesitated longer. Those notebooks contained 3 years of my thinking, every failed hypothesis, every chemical adjustment, every strange anomaly that eventually led to the stabilization breakthrough. But eventually, I handed them over. At the time, it felt like a reasonable request. Executives wanted to understand the science behind the company's most valuable project. What I didn't realize then was something far more important. Vanessa wasn't studying the research. She was studying the one step the official reports never fully explained. The single adjustment that made the entire platform work. And once she understood that detail, she didn't need me in the room anymore. A few nights after Vanessa borrowed my notebooks, I returned to the lab later than usual. It was close to 10 in the evening. The research wing was almost empty. The long corridor outside the laboratory lit by the cold glow of overhead fluorescent lights. I had forgotten to refrigerate a set of samples that needed to stabilize overnight. Normally, that kind of mistake would only cost me an hour of extra work. That night, it revealed something much more important. When I reached my workstation, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. The drawer where I kept my notebooks was slightly open, not wide enough to be obvious, but not closed the way I always left it either. I slid the drawer open slowly. The notebooks were still there, but they weren't arranged the same way. Scientists develop habits without realizing it. My notes were always stacked in a specific order, recent experiments on top, older reaction logs underneath. Now the order had changed. Someone had been reading them. For a moment, I stood there staring at the drawer, trying to decide if I was imagining things. Then I remembered something. The lab corridor had security cameras. Senior researchers had clearance to request footage when equipment or research materials were involved. So the next morning, I asked security to pull the recordings from the previous night. The technician didn't ask questions. A few minutes later, the footage appeared on the monitor. The timestamp read 10:27 p.m. The hallway outside the lab door was empty. Then Vanessa Calloway walked into frame. She used her executive badge to unlock the research wing and stepped inside. The footage from the interior camera showed her walking straight toward my workstation. No hesitation, no confusion. She opened the drawer. Then she spent nearly 20 minutes reading through my notebooks, watching the footage. I felt something colder than anger. I felt foolish, because in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. Vanessa hadn't been trying to understand the science. She had been searching for the one thing she couldn't steal from the presentation slides, the exact timing adjustment that made the stabilization reaction work. And once she believed she had it, she walked into that investor meeting like the discovery was hers. The morning after the investor meeting, I returned to Helixera's research wing for one reason: to clear out my desk. After what happened in that boardroom, staying at the company no longer made sense. My work had been taken, my presentation hijacked, and the CEO had made it very clear whose side he was on. But the moment I stepped into the laboratory, something felt strange. The room was unusually quiet. Normally, by that hour, the research floor was full of movement technicians calibrating instruments, researchers discussing reaction data, machines humming steadily in the background. That morning, people were standing in small groups, speaking in low voices. A technician glanced at me and quickly looked away. Another scientist stopped typing the moment I walked past. That was the first sign something had gone wrong. One of the junior researchers approached me cautiously. "Lillian," he said quietly, "have you talked to Elliot yet?" I shook my head. "Why?" He hesitated before answering. "We've been trying to reproduce yesterday's stabilization run." He exhaled slowly. "It keeps failing." Across the lab, two technicians were resetting the reaction chamber. I paused beside the monitoring screen as the process restarted. Temperature stabilized. The compound entered the chamber. Catalyst introduced. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then the monitor flashed red. Compound degradation detected. One of the technicians swore under his breath. "Run it again." They did. The second attempt failed. Then a third. Same result every time. The compound broke down seconds after the stabilization phase began. That was when a familiar voice cut across the room. "Lillian." I turned. Elliot Calloway was standing near the hallway outside his office. Arms crossed. For the first time since I had known him. The confident CEO looked genuinely unsettled. "My office," he said. "Now?" Inside. He didn't sit down. He stared at me for several seconds before speaking. "What exactly did you do to the stabilization process?" I blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The team can't reproduce your results," he said sharply. "The platform isn't working." I leaned against the table calmly. "That sounds inconvenient." At that moment, the office door opened. Vanessa stepped inside. The confidence she had shown during the presentation was gone. "You sabotaged it," she said. I looked at her quietly. "Why would I do that?" Vanessa's accusation hung in the air for several seconds. "You sabotaged it," she repeated, though her voice sounded less certain the second time. I looked from her to Elliot. Why would I sabotage my own research? I asked calmly. Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, Elliot stepped forward. The investors are returning tomorrow, he said. They expect a live demonstration of the stabilization platform. That explained everything. The presentation had impressed them, but investors rarely commit billions based on slides alone. They wanted proof. And suddenly, the platform that Vanessa had confidently claimed as her own wasn't working. Elliot studied my face carefully. You're the only person who understands the reaction adjustments, he said. The admission clearly irritated him. You'll assist the team tomorrow. I shook my head slowly. I don't think that's necessary. Vanessa's expression hardened. You can't just walk away, she said. I thought yesterday made your position very clear. I replied. You said you didn't need my ideas anymore. The room went silent. For the first time. Elliot seemed unsure how to respond. The truth was obvious to everyone standing there. They could copy my slides. They could repeat my explanation, but they couldn't reproduce the result. I picked up my bag from the chair beside the desk. Good luck with the demonstration, I said quietly, as I walked across the research floor toward the exit. Another stabilization run began behind me. Temperature stabilized. Catalyst introduced. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then the alarm sounded again. Compound degradation detected. Someone cursed loudly. Another technician reset the system. I kept walking, because the problem they were trying to solve wasn't in the equipment, it wasn't in the formula, and it definitely wasn't something they could find inside my old presentation. The missing piece was something much smaller, just a few seconds of timing, but without it, the entire platform collapsed every single time, and the only person who knew exactly when that moment occurred was already leaving the building. Elliot Calloway arrived at my apartment just after sunset. I recognized the car before I even opened the door. A black executive sedan parked on a quiet residential street tends to stand out. When the doorbell rang, I already knew who it was. I opened the door and found Elliot standing there in the hallway, still wearing the same tailored suit he had worn in the boardroom the day before. He didn't bother with small talk. We need to talk, he said. It wasn't a request. I stepped aside and let him enter. For a moment, he stood in the center of the living room, glancing around at the space, the shelves of research books, the stacks of printed data reports, the laptop still open on my kitchen table. My apartment looked nothing like the polished executive offices at Helixera. Finally, he turned toward me. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked. I crossed my arms. I resigned, I replied calmly. You walked out of an investor presentation, he corrected sharply, after your daughter shut off my slides and presented my research as her own. Elliot's expression didn't change. He had already decided that part of the story didn't matter. The stabilization platform was developed inside Helixera facilities, he said. On company time, using company resources. I leaned against the kitchen counter. So that makes it yours. That makes the technology ours, he said firmly. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then he continued. The investors are returning tomorrow. They expect a working demonstration. I didn't respond. You're the only one who knows the exact adjustments in the reaction cycle, he said. And there it was. The real reason he had come. You need me, I said. Elliot didn't deny it. Instead, he spoke more carefully. You'll return to the lab tomorrow and help the team reproduce the stabilization run. I walked slowly toward the kitchen table. Then I turned the laptop screen toward him. A legal document filled the display. Novagen Research Lab's Certificate of Incorporation. I registered the company 3 weeks ago, I said quietly, for the first time that evening. Elliot Calloway looked uncertain. The investors returned to Helixera the next morning exactly as planned. 15 people from different investment firms walked into the research wing, expecting to see the technology they had applauded the day before. This time, there were no presentation slides. They wanted a live demonstration inside the lab. Technicians had already prepared the stabilization experiment. Reaction chambers glowed softly under laboratory lights, while data monitors displayed real-time analysis. Vanessa stood at the main station. She looked confident. Her eyes weren't. Today, we'll demonstrate the stabilization phase in real time. She announced. The experiment began. Temperature stabilized. The compound entered the chamber. Catalyst introduced. For a few seconds, everything looked exactly the way it should. Then the monitor flashed red. Compound degradation detected. A technician leaned closer to the screen. That's not right. Reset the cycle. Someone said. They tried again. Same result. Another failure, then a third. Across the room, the investors exchanged quiet looks. Finally, Marcus Langford, the lead investor, spoke. Could you explain the stabilization adjustment step? He asked Vanessa. She hesitated. The compound reaches equilibrium during catalyst exposure, she said. Marcus waited. And what determines the timing of that adjustment? Vanessa glanced toward the technicians. It's part of the automated system. Several scientists shifted uncomfortably. Elliot stepped forward quickly. Live demonstrations can be unpredictable, he said with a practiced smile. But the room had already changed. The confidence from the previous day was gone. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar when I answered. A calm voice spoke on the other end. Doctor, more. This is Marcus Langford from Titan Bridge Capital. There was a short pause. I think we should talk about your stabilization platform. 2 hours later, the same 15 investors stood inside a much smaller laboratory across the city. No glass walls, no corporate branding, just a rented workspace and the reaction chamber I had assembled quietly weeks earlier. Can you show us it works? Marcus asked. I nodded. The experiment began, and this time, the stabilization curve appeared perfectly on the monitor. The compound held steady. No alarms, no degradation. Marcus looked up slowly. So the platform works? Yes, I said, just not without me. The investors stayed in the lab for nearly an hour. They didn't take my word for anything. They reran the stabilization cycle themselves, checked the reaction data, and compared it to the reports Helixera had shown the day before. Every result told the same story. The platform worked, just not inside Helixera's lab. That evening, Titan Bridge Capital contacted Helixera's executive board. Until the company could prove it actually controlled the stabilization technology, the $2.4 billion partnership was officially suspended. Inside the company, panic spread quickly. The board demanded explanations. Why had the lead scientist behind the platform left the day before the demonstration? Why couldn't the research team reproduce the technology they had presented to investors within 48 hours? Elliot Callaway was no longer CEO. Officially, it was called a leadership transition. A week later, the same investors visited my new lab. This time they weren't asking questions. They were offering funding, because in the end, they realized something very simple. You can steal a presentation, you can copy a report, but you can't steal 3 years of understanding that lives inside someone else's mind. Standing in that boardroom, watching someone claim my work as if it were theirs, I learned something no textbook ever teaches. Knowledge isn't just data on slides or reports in a database. It lives in the patience, mistakes, and quiet hours no one else sees. No one can take that away unless you decide your voice no longer matters. Sometimes the real test isn't whether people treat you fairly, but whether you keep believing in the value of what you've built. If you were in that room, what would you have done? Would you stay silent? Or would you protect the work you gave years of your life to? And before you go, tell me where you're listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing it. Those small actions might help someone else remember their worth, and sometimes that reminder can change everything. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.